Today, I'm going to be talking about planning and preparing for a photography trip. I'm going to cover some of my tips, tricks, and strategies I use for every single photography trip I take. So photography trips are top of mind for me this week, as next week I'm heading off to West Virginia to lead a photography workshop. And because of that, I'm in the middle of getting ready, getting my things packed, and getting everything in place so that next week's workshop is successful. I'm a believer that photography trips will actually grow your landscape photography in more of a way than most any camera gear can. So it helps you see new places, experience new places, help you dedicate some time towards the photography, and I think trips are important. You get to come home with some great experiences and some unique images that you're not able to capture every day in your local area. So I'll be talking about choosing a location, researching a location, tips for travel, what to pack, and some tips on what to do once you get there to make the most of your trip. So first up, you have to figure out where you want to go. You might be like me and sort of have a running list of places you want to go, or you might be new to landscape photography and you really haven't even started thinking about good places to go. So let's focus on the latter, because all of this advice can be applied to a list you already have as well. So for example, how long are you going to be able to go and spend on this trip? Is it a weekend, a long weekend, a week? Once you have that, then you need to figure out sort of your means of travel, because that's going to factor into where can you reach and still have a reasonable amount of time to spend there. So you may be driving, maybe you're flying, and as you start to narrow that down, you're going to start to realize how far you can go. If you're flying, you can probably get cross country for a long-ish weekend. If you're driving, then you may need to stick a little closer to home, maybe the state next door, or just even a couple hours away in your state. So as you start to narrow that down, you start to look at the map. And what I usually do is look at the maps or scroll around. Usually you have some ideas of maybe where you want to go, and you start plugging them in and see, can you reach this destination in a reasonable amount of time? And you sort of narrow down the process that way. So how much time do you have? How are you getting there? And then what falls in that range and budget to go to? So beyond those basic factors, you also probably want to consider the weather conditions. What time of year is it? You know, certain scenes may work better in the fall or work better in the winter or springtime, and start matching those up. So once you've worked through those options and you have your place identified, then we move on to the next step. So once you've chosen a location, it's time to start researching that location, starting to figure some things out, learning a little more about the place. And I typically do this through obviously a series of Google searches, taking a look at park websites, and even looking through Instagram, looking for location tags, and taking in that whole variety of sources, even just scrolling the Google Maps, just to scroll around and see what looks interesting. A lot of times there'll be a little mark on the map for something interesting, and you can start to get ideas or trigger search keywords to start looking for. But here's some of the key things I look for when I start my research. First, are permits required? A lot of the different parks are starting to require permits, and some are requiring timed entry permits. So if you're trying to go to a national park that's very busy, see if they have a timed entry permit system, because you don't want to show up to a national park, realize you can't get in because they're using a timed entry permit. You can figure this out usually on the park website, so I highly recommend checking those out. A lot of the more popular parks are starting to do this timed entry system, so you don't want to get caught not knowing that when you head out. Then you want to look at lodging options, because if you're sort of a hotel type person, want to stay indoors with all of that, you want to make sure there's hotels nearby, or at least identify what's close to these spots. Maybe you're more of a campground person and you want to identify where those are at, and then work on the reservation process from there to make sure you have a place to stay when you reach your destination. Then there's the food options. Some places I go to, the grocery stores are super small, and if I want something special, might want to make sure I bring it myself. Other places, there's lots of food options. In some cases, there's not very many restaurants if you like to go eat out while you're on your trips, so you want to come prepared with your own food. So thinking about food and what the options are going to be is important before you get there, so that you have what you need to eat while you're there. So those are some of the logistics about staying and where you're going to eat. And through the Google searches and the maps, you can start to identify locations like the sites. Is there particular waterfalls or particular vista? And what I do is I actually tend to make a spreadsheet where I list the general title of the place. So for example, such and such overlook. And I'll put it on there. I'll make little notes about it, like what road is it off of? Is it close to the park? Is it maybe an overlook that's 45 minutes away, a little further away? And I start making a whole list. And just because it makes the list doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to go there. It's just giving me options to do a little bit of additional research. And I find having that list helps me once I reach the location to know where I want to go, or if weather prevents something, having an alternative to go to. So I find that spreadsheet very helpful, and I will do everything from notes about the parking area. If it's something a little more remote and there's GPS coordinates I can find, I might plug in the GPS coordinates. Anything so that when I'm out there, I can quickly look at my list and have the information I need to visit the location without having to do a lot of internet researching or anything like that. I like to go into it knowing that I have that list before I get there. Like I said, as far as where I get that information from, it's a series of Google searches, looking at Google Maps, doing some Instagram location searches, going to park websites, and even asking my friends that might have traveled out there before and seeing if they have any recommendations or places I should visit or any insight to the area. Now, like I said, I put a lot of things on this spreadsheet, and I find being deliberate is helpful, but I try not to overschedule and overplan. I'm really just making sure I go into this trip with options so that as the weather changes or my energy level changes, I can pick and choose where I want to go, but I've already done the research, so it's nice and easy to do on the fly, nice and flexible. So I don't like to overplan it and like schedule these visits out, but I like to have the options when I get out there, and I try to be a little deliberate on that front. So you've chosen a location, you've done some additional research on this location, you've got your spreadsheet full of locations to go. So now you're getting to the travel phase, and I do have a few tips for travel. One, obviously make your reservations, whether they be hotel or campground. Make sure you have those in place before you head out. Make sure you know what you're doing for food in case you need to pack extra food, or if you're going to be able to rely on getting food easily out there that fits your schedule. Make sure you get a little bit of cash to go. Again, if you've researched it, you're going to know whether there's a permit system or an entry fee or timed entry permits. Make sure you have all that in order so you know either have that scheduled and ready, or you have a plan to be able to take care of that once you get there. All important before you head out on this trip. If you're driving, make sure you have your car all prepped, oil changed, air in the tires, anything like that as far as car related, so that the trip goes well from that front. I usually like to make sure all my windshield is nice and clean, just so it's a nice, easy trip. If you're flying, I do have videos on preparing to travel for flying, and I will link to those down in the description below. Lots of tips on how to pack your camera bag to get your camera gear there that would be well worth watching if you're flying for your trip. And if it's an extended trip, make sure you got someone checking your mail. Make sure you're either putting on hold or someone's getting in the mailbox. And I always like to make sure I get the grass cut before I go, just so I don't come back to complete jungle in the yard when I get back. So those are just some of my tips for travel. Not an exhaustive list, but ones that I do find helpful. Just sort of think about what you want to have in place before you go. And then you've got packing for the trip. And I have this in two categories, and I have packing lists that I use for this so that I can reference, and over time they get better so that I'm less likely to forget taking something with me. But I have my packing list split up into two topics: my camera gear, and then just sort of my clothing and general trip gear that you would normally take. So for camera gear, I sort of have it broken up into the basics, which is, one or two camera bodies, my core set of lenses, and, there's factors like, am I going to be carrying it around a lot? I might make a different lens choice. I try to think about that all ahead of time. But in addition, make sure you've got your memory cards, make sure you've got your batteries, make sure the batteries are charged before you leave, make sure you take battery chargers. Make sure you take memory cards. I like to prep my memory cards before I go. I don't want to be out there with memory cards that are half full or anything like that. So take all of that into consideration. Those are some of the basics to take care of regarding the camera gear. And I like to start thinking and packing well ahead of time, at least the week before, so I can start putting things together, make sure I've got everything. Nothing worse than trying to leave the morning of a trip and not knowing where your filters are at. And then as we move into general packing, that's the clothing setup. And again, this is going to vary widely based on time of year and where you're going, from a cold climate to a warm climate to just one of those spring climates where you don't know if it's going to be warm or cold. So my general rule of thumb is I have a set of core basics I like to take, and I take a layering approach. So I find that if I take a layering approach, it makes it easy to start out nice and warm in the morning, shed some layers during the day as it warms up, and have layers to put back on for the evening at sunset. So a layering approach is super important. I tend towards more of the tech clothing when I do, just because it dries fast. So if it gets wet or it rains or anything like that, most of it will dry pretty quickly. And those are some of the considerations, from a clothing wise. Depending on the ruggedness of the hikes, for example, I always take hiking boots because I like nice sturdy boots even on easier hikes. I still like a nice sturdy boot because of the camera bag I carry. In some trips, I find hiking poles are near a requirement just because it makes it so much easier to hike down steep slopes when I'm carrying that camera bag. So I sort of have some comprehensive packing lists, which I will link to the access to those down in the description below, because I actually have packing lists that I use set up for my camera setup and the clothing setup, and you might find them useful. Again, link down below for that. So another tip beyond just having the list of things to pack, what I find is really helpful is about a week before my trip as I set up a basket and I just have it in an easy to access location. So as I'm going throughout the week and I have these last minute, oh, I don't want to forget to take this, but I haven't actually opened any of my bags yet and started packing, I just toss them in that basket. And that can be anything from, oh, I want to make sure I remember to take this map, so put it in the basket. Or maybe, you know, rain covers for my camera, and I'll toss it in the basket. And that way, when I get closer that day or two before I actually start filling up, you know, my travel bags, I can just go to that basket and it's going to have all those random miscellaneous things I thought of along the way that I wanted to take but didn't want to write down and didn't want to forget to pack. So I just toss them in that basket. Super handy tip, and it works out really well for me. So now you've finished choosing a location, researching a location, preparing for the trip, and packing for the location, and the day has come and you arrive at the location for this photography trip. And really, if you've done all that prior stuff, things should be pretty well in order. You're packed well, you've got all your gear, you have a list of places you want to go see and do during your time frame, and really the biggest impact is going to be weather. And weather's not necessarily a negative impact. It may be that you're going to get some dramatic skies, and that means this certain area you wanted to go to is going to be best then. Maybe overcast and rainy, and that may make another area that you have selected on your trip a little better or worse than another. So this is where I see once you reach location, it's that weather impact that helps decide what you're going to do. There's another element of just how much energy you have. For example, if you underestimate how strenuous a hike was in the morning, you may want to scale back your afternoon adventures to help let yourself recover from maybe a too strenuous hike. But again, this is where that deliberateness of the spreadsheet really helps you be able to pick and choose places while you're there and slot them in based on weather conditions and energy levels. So since weather is so important, I really sort of have 3 apps I use when I get on location, and really actually leading up to the location so I can sort of have an idea of what the weather is going to be like. Obviously, as we get a little closer, the weather forecast gets a little more accurate, and there's sort of 3 main sites I use for this. The first, in real general, this is just for my general forecast information, just get a high-level feel of what things are going to be like when I get out there. I tend to use wonderground.com for that. It lets me mark my favorites, and I can, you know, view the 10-day forecast and get an idea for what's coming. So I start to get more specific and really start to see how things are moving through the day. So for example, I've arrived, I'm expecting, you know, dramatic skies in the evening. And so what I'll do is that afternoon, then I'll sort of move towards windy.com, which is a very powerful app. And I sort of get an idea of what the cloud cover looks like. Is the cloud cover still coming? Is there going to be a gap in the clouds somewhere? And it can also give me information on rain and the chance of fog in the morning. So when I'm out there on site, I tend to use windy.com for those finer weather forecasts to help me really predict what it's going to be like in 3 hours or 4 hours. I find it gets a little more granular than the larger websites like wonderground.com with a little more accuracy. So windy.com is a big one that I use. And the other one I use, which is sort of in between a Wonderground and a Windy, is I use weather.gov, which is the government weather, which really a lot of these forecasts are based on anyways. But they have some interesting maps to take a look at and can give me an idea of what the weather's going to be like as well. And again, I take those weather elements and I just sort of shift around through my spreadsheet and based on energy level and weather, slot in where I want to go and go on from there. And really, that's my biggest on-location tip is be in tune with the weather, be in tune with your energy level, and pick and choose from those places you want to see on that spreadsheet to make sure you get a great trip. So that's it. That's my high-level look at how I sort of plan for a trip, how I prepare for a trip, some of my tips for travel, and what I do when I get on location. I hope you found that helpful. And like I said, if you've got some extra money to spend, instead of looking for that new lens or that new camera body that you probably don't really need, look at taking a trip. I feel will help reinvigorate your creativity. It'll help you come home with some images that are unique and different, which will be useful, and it'll just help really refine your landscape photography to get out there and photograph different locations. And I find it very energizing. So I think photography trips are very important, and traveling for photography is a great way to grow your skill set. So this was a very high-level look at how I do approach this. I have done webinars on this specific topic of photography, travel, and planning, and I have a recorded version of that webinar which I will link to down in the description below, and that is a full-length recording of where I talk about all of these topics a little more in-depth, as well as provide my packing list for both camera gear and clothing, which I think a lot of people would find helpful because you can just sort of work your way through, check off the items, modify them as you go, but it'll help make sure you remember those basics. So like I said, if you're interested in viewing that recorded webinar or downloading those packing lists, link down in the description, sign up and you'll have immediate access to both the recording and the packing list that I think you'll find helpful. So if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.